Well, I think, it is quite alarming that our study found that there are large numbers of South African children who are exposed to violence on a daily basis. I think it's really important to firstly say that we don't know exactly how many children are affected, but we certainly know that community-based studies are showing us that more than 50% of South Africa's children have experienced of physical violence either by a caregiver, a relative or a school teacher. So that's certainly huge numbers of South Africa's children.
Prof, we do know that poverty does not necessarily equate to violence, but it is true that our poorer communities, such as Diepsloot or Delft for that matter, which made headlines for violent crime against minors, are also more susceptible to violence. Many areas like these do lack access to social services and have high unemployment. Talk to us of the link between poverty, social services, unemployment and abuse.
I think it's very important that we start understanding that, violence is a very complex problem and that it certainly intersects with issues such as poverty itself. But it's not poverty per se that escalates the extent of violence, but that you have to start looking at the social context in which poverty occurs. And it certainly intersects with what we see as, the legacy of apartheid, where we have large communities that's quite poor and deprived with very few social services. So all of that impacts then on what we see in terms of family formation, how disorganized families are, as well as communities unable to support families to necessarily care and protect their children in environments that's gang infested where there's alcohol and drug abuse. And that in itself then raises the vulnerability of children to be exposed to violence within their homes, within communities, as well as their schools.
A Stats SA in a recent report said that South Africa has one of the highest rates of what they call father absence on the globe, due to our history and the migratory labour system, resulting in the painful legacy you've just mentioned, where children are left in vulnerable or what we call unconventional family structures. The reality is that, the reality is that the majority of SA's children are growing up without a functioning family unit. How do we get around this in a nutshell?
Well, I think I agree with you. Certainly, large numbers of South Africa's children are not living in a conventional family, as you say, and that in itself leads to its vulnerability. So it's really important that we start looking at how we support our current family structures. We know that only 40% of South Africa's children are living with a mother. Only a third of South Africa's children are living with a conventional family with mother and a father around. And 25% of South Africa's children are living with not one of their parents. And that's really staggering. And it's really important that we start looking at how we support and provide, particularly our single mothers, with support to care and protect children. We also have to look at how our communities are structured in order for children who are vulnerable and not living with families to still have access to the necessary services and support that they require.
It's also important to remember that child sexual abuse or violent crime against women and children occurs across the board in the country, regardless of economic status, race or background. In your experience, Prof, how challenging is the lack of coordination between the three main response units? I'm talking about the SAPS, social services and pathology services for that matter.
I think that that's a huge problem, the fact that our services are not working together. I've done work around child homicides and particularly children who are killed in relation to fatal child abuse. And most of those cases are then investigated by the police without thinking of that child actually comes from a family and there are other children within that family that needs to be protected. Unless we start getting a coordinated response and leadership at the highest level in South Africa to start looking at how we as a country have one plan to respond to this epidemic, we're not going to shift our experiences. It's really important that government starts investing not just in responding to the problem but also preventing the problem, and that they start looking at how they're allocating money towards improving not just service delivery for response and therapeutic services, but also preventing this from happening in the first instance.
Thank you, Prof, for your time on the PM News Desk. That was Professor Shanaz Matthews, the Director of the Children's Institute at the University of Kent.